Okay, so today we're going to talk about positive and negative relationships. And, I guess we can start out by saying, hey, things aren't all a bed of roses or, puppies and rainbows or, whatever happy thoughts you have. And we kind of looked at relationships and social networks as a completely positive experience, in the workplace, et cetera. But, some relationships that we have are negative or antagonistic. And it's not always a positive relationship between any two given people. So what we can do with our social networks is we can reason about both these positive and negative relationships by annotating our links with positive or negative signs. And then we'll try to understand the tension between these two forces using a notion called structural balance. And a recurring issue in this will be the fact that local effects, basically looking at a few nodes at a time, can have consequences for the entire network. So I guess we should start off with a little bit about structural balance. Now, we haven't done a formal definition yet, but we will. We need to start with the notion of a complete graph, and that's a network or graph in which every node is linked to every other node. It's also called a clique, which is kind of confusing, but we'll call them complete graphs here. We label every edge with a positive or minus sign. There aren't any neutral parties here. You either have positive feelings and positive relationship with another person or a negative relationship with another person. For groups of three, certain configurations are more plausible. All positive, three mutual friends, that's balance. That's an entirely natural thing to have happen. One positive and two negatives, that means that there's a mutual enemy. Again, that's balanced. There's nothing that needs to go on. The mutual enemy will probably always be a mutual enemy, so it's a balanced situation. Now, if you have two pluses and one minus, you have A who has two friends, B and C don't like each other. That situation is unbalanced because it's going to put A in a difficult situation, especially if it's a workplace, because A will eventually have to make a decision that involves B and C and have to come down on either side, in which case the other person will become unhappy. All negative, that's mutual enemies, and that's not balanced either. We'll take a look at that a little bit later, but in general, for now, it's not a balanced situation. And in all negative situations, two people will kind of eventually team up to take on the third who's viewed as worse than the other one. So in general, people try to minimize unbalanced relationships in real life. There are certain workplaces where that's not the case, but in general, they try to avoid these unbalanced types of relationships. So the structural balance property says for every set of three nodes, if we consider the three edges connecting them, either all three of the edges are labeled positive, mutual friendships, or else exactly one of them is labeled plus, which is the mutual enemy. Structural balanced networks have interesting properties. So the one on the left is balanced, and we can check that by seeing that each three node set is balanced. A, B, and C, A and B have a mutual enemy in C. A, B, and D, A and B have a mutual enemy in D. B, C, and D, C and D have a mutual enemy in B. The one on the right is not balanced. Here, A, B, C has two pluses and one minus, which we said was not a balanced network. So characterizing the structure of these balanced networks, what do they look like? In short, either everybody likes each other or there are two groups of mutual friends who are mutually antagonistic toward the other group. So the balance theorem states this a little bit more formally. If a labeled complete graph is balanced, then either all pairs of nodes are friends, or else the nodes can be divided into two groups, X and Y, such that every pair of nodes in X like each other, every pair of nodes in Y like each other, and everyone in X is the enemy of everyone in Y. So the balance theorem, this can actually be proven, and it's not obvious, but it is interesting. Here, a logical structure implies a global structure for the entire network. So let's take a look at how we would prove this. So assume we have a complete graph, and this is arbitrarily labeled, and we also require it to be balanced. we'll show that everyone is either friends or there are sets X and Y that are mutual enemies as described in the theorem. So the first case is we get this arbitrarily labeled graph and all lines are labeled with pluses. Hey, that's great. Everybody likes each other. And we get the correct conclusion from the balance theorem. Case number 2 gets a bit trickier. We have at least one negative edge. So what do? We pick an arbitrary node and call it A. From A's perspective, either everyone else is a friend or an enemy. We divide them into 2 groups. X are the friends of A and Y are the enemies of A. Now we need to show every 2 nodes in X are friends, every 2 nodes in Y are friends, and every node in X is an enemy of every node in Y. Let's see how far the assumptions that we have in that theorem can take us. So every 2 nodes in X are friends. Well, if we have A and remember X is A's friends, and we have B and C that are in X, then B and C can't be enemies, because if they were enemies, there'd be a minus sign where that question mark is, and that would violate the balance condition. Remember, we said the graph had to be balanced. We would have 2 pluses and 1 minus. Okay, how about every 2 nodes in Y are friends? Okay, so A is enemies with D and E. If they were enemies, then there would be 3 minuses, which would violate that balance condition. But 2 minuses and a plus, that makes things okay because there's a mutual enemy in A. Okay, now how about the last condition where the set X can't be friends with the set Y? So imagine B was friends with D, there would be a plus there, and again, we would have the 2 pluses and the minus sign, which we said wasn't a balanced relationship. So there has to be a negative sign going from B to D in order to achieve the balance condition. And that completes our proof. So what are some applications of structural balance? There's been some research on networks and how they move towards structural balance. The mathematics involved become quite complicated in the words of the authors, and they're similar to models of physical systems as they move to minimize their energy. There are 2 application areas. One is international relations, and the other is social media site and online rankings. So in terms of international relations, the first example that they have deals with shifting European relations prior to World War I. There's another one which involves the subcontinent, but this is Europe prior to World War I. And we start with the 3 emperors league, where Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Germany were all friends. Italy, nobody really knew Italy at that point, but the Triple Alliance, which had 4, formed with Italy making friends with everybody. And then the German-Russian lapse, those 2 groups don't always get along. And so the Germans broke it off with the Russians, which left them antagonistic towards Austria-Hungary and still claimed not to know Italy. The French-Russian alliance happens, and France makes a tie to Russia, which then the Entente Cordiale in 1904, France makes a tie with Great Britain, positive between France and Great Britain, positive with France and Russia. And of course, the British-Russian alliance happens and fills in that triangle. And what's interesting is you can see the world divide into these 2 groups of mutually friendly but antagonistic towards everyone else that we talked about in that structural balance. Another couple of studies looked at Slashdot and opinions, and I had to look it up to see whether these 2 were still a thing. I hadn't thought about Slashdot in years and hadn't heard of opinions, but apparently opinions was merged into shopping.com in 2018, and Slashdot is still going strong. And Slashdot users were able to designate one another as either friend or foe, and hey, I would imagine a foe would be somebody who fell on the other side of the VIM Emacs debate, but not sure how that works. And that opinions, users could express trust or distrust of other users in terms of their review. Guha, et cetera, looked at opinions, and what was interesting here was a directed graph. So you might consider me as untrustworthy, but I don't know you. So the relations went one way. They were directed graphs. And so these directed edges made things a little bit more complicated. And the other question was, does distrust imply that animus exists? Is there necessarily a negative relationship or an enemy type status that goes along with distrust? That might be the case for political books, given the if we were reading political books, in our current political climate, that might be the case. But if it were electronics, there might not be any negative feelings involved. I, might not trust somebody because they hadn't completed enough views or enough reviews, or, didn't have the stature in the area in order to have established that trust. So it might not be a negative relationship, or, one person likes Sony, one person likes Panasonic. So there might not be any negative feelings involved, depending upon what the topic was. So this leads us to, are there weaker forms of structural balance? And recall that only certain types of networks can work. Balanced networks, what happens if we allow triangles with 3 negative edges? What if we weaken that a little bit? So we have mutual enemies. In that case, we have a weakly balanced graph. So the weak structural balance property says there's no set of 3 nodes such that the edges among them consist of exactly 2 positive edges and 1 negative edge, but we allow the 3 negative edges. So weakly balanced networks are what results. And if a labeled complete graph is weakly balanced, then its nodes can be divided into groups in such a way that every 2 nodes belonging to the same group are friends, and every 2 nodes belonging to different groups are enemies. So, here we see the set W, mutual friends that are inside of W, but they're antagonistic towards every other set. And in fact, weakly balanced networks will have precisely the structure in this diagram. A complete graph is weakly balanced precisely when it can be divided into multiple sets of mutual friends with complete mutual antagonism towards each pair of the other sets. Weak structural balance allows us to reason about cases where a network has more than 2 factions. So generalizing structural balance a little bit further, it's been pretty demanding to have structural balance. One, it only applies to complete graphs. Now, what if some of the pairs don't know each other? We have an incomplete graph. And we also have this global division of the world into 2 fractions. This applies to the case in which every triangle is balanced. Can we relax this to say that if most of the triangles are balanced, then the world can be approximately divided into 2 factions? So here we're looking at if the network is not complete, then we can have 3 situations that are between 2 pairs of nodes: positive, negative, and I don't know you. That's not my person. Which, by the way, is probably the greatest martial arts technique. The 5-point exploding palm technique. I don't know. It's a toss-up between those 2, but this one's excellent. But so we can divide things into positive, negative, and hey, I don't know this other node. So in terms of balance, we can look either locally or globally for balances in these non-complete networks. Option 1 is, we sit there and we make educated guesses as to missing values to produce a signed complete graph. And then option 2, determine if it's possible to divide the nodes into 2 sets X and Y so that all the edges inside node X and inside node Y or inside group Y are positive, and connecting edges between the 2 sets are negative. These 2 methods are equivalent by the balance theorem. We can use either way of determining or setting up the balancing of the network, depending on what's convenient. Sadly, neither one gives us a way to check if the graph is balanced, and Harari did some work on this. It shows us a way to check whether a graph is balanced. This one here is not balanced, so let's put 1 inside of X. 1 is friends with itself, obviously. Then that means 2, there's a plus sign going from 1 to 2. 2's got to be an X, friend of 1. Now there's a minus sign. 2 and 3 are enemies, so 3 has to go in Y. 3 is positive with 4, so 4 has to go into Y because it's friends with 3. Now 5 is an enemy of 4, so it goes into X. Oh, but 5 is also an enemy of 1, so 1 would have to go into Y, so that, because it can't be in the same set as X. So the problem that we have here is an odd number of negative edges, and a sign graph is balanced if and only if it contains no cycle with an odd number of negative edges, and that turns out to be necessary and sufficient for showing that something is not balanced or something is balanced. You can also see this in figure 5.8 if you want to take a look at another example in the textbook. And we can verify this claim through an argument using supernodes, or we can verify it using breadth first search, which amounts to showing that the graph is bipartite into groups X and Y. We can also rewrite the balance theorem in a more relaxed manner so that we can have approximately balanced network. So here's a claim: if at least 99.9% of all triangles in a labeled complete graph are balanced, then either A, there's a set consisting of at least 90% of the nodes in which at least 90% of the pairs are friends, or the nodes can be divided into two groups, X and Y, such that at least 90% of the pairs in X like each other, at least 90% of the pairs in Y like each other, and at least 90% of the pairs with one end in X and the other end in Y are enemies. So that weakens things considerably. Now that 99.9% comes from the mathematical definition. You have an epsilon and you have to do a transformation of that epsilon. And because we chose 90% for that epsilon, then we do the transformation, we end up with 99.9%. You can find that formal mathematical definition on page 144 to 145 of the text and the formal mathematical proof following. Thanks so much for watching.